Good evening. How far back can we trace the history of Egypt? To understand this, we must first address a problem with the chronology itself. It was invented by a man named Manetho. Manetho was a court historian who lived in the 3rd century BC under the rule of the Ptolemies. Since the Ptolemies were Greeks, they didn't care much about deep Egyptian history, but they were curious about the country Alexander the Great had conquered. So Manetho gathered the Egyptian priests, collected all available sources, and compiled a history of Egypt. The Egyptians themselves never bothered to rationalize their daily life or organize their history into a neat timeline. So Manetho simply took the 3,000 years of history before him and conveniently divided them into 30 dynasties. This is why, to this day, history books often begin with the first dynasty. However, about 50 years ago, archaeologists had to introduce a dynasty 0. And now, increasingly, we speak of a dynasty 00, going back another 200 years, to explain the processes of Egypt's formation. We must discuss pre-dynastic Egypt because, for example, writing appeared there before the first dynasty. A note on names. You will hear Greek names today. We know how to pronounce Greek names, but with Egyptian names, there is a problem. For example, the goddess Isis. In the ancient Egyptian language, feminine names always ended in the letter T, like Sekhmet or Tefnut. So why Isis? Because we don't know exactly how the original name was pronounced, perhaps Esset. So we use the Greek versions like Isis, Osiris, and Horus, which have become the standard in the European scientific tradition. Let's start at the very beginning, the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 to 13,000 years ago. During the Ice Age, northern Africa was a hardcore desert. It was practically uninhabitable. But as the ice melted, water returned. Africa began to transform. The Sahara became a savanna-vast grassy plains. Imagine a landscape filled with rivers and lakes. People returned to this land. At that time, the Nile River was very different. It did not yet have its famous delta. The river didn't fan out but crashed directly into the sea. It was powerful and dangerous. There were massive tributaries, what we now call wadis or dry canyons that flowed from the Nile all the way to the Red Sea. The region was teeming with African megafauna, elephants, giraffes, antelopes, and hippos. We see depictions of these animals in rock art scattered across the desert. The people here were hunters. They didn't need to farm because the land provided everything. They even domesticated the aurochs, the giant wild ancestor of the cow, independently from the rest of the world. They herded these cattle as a backup food source, but mostly they hunted and gathered wild grains like sorghum. Unlike in Mesopotamia, where people had to organize to survive, the early Egyptians had no reason to build irrigation canals or unite. They lived freely in the savanna. But around 6,000 BC, the climate began to change. We call this period the Neolithic Rains. People began to practice primitive agriculture, and they were already watching the stars. At places like Nabta Playa, high in the Nile Valley, they built megalithic structures aligned with the star Sirius. Sirius would become the central star of Egyptian civilization because its appearance in the sky predicted the flooding of the Nile. Around 5,500 BC, new technologies began to arrive from Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent. While the Egyptians were wandering the savanna, the people of the East were already building cities. Migrants and traders brought advanced pottery techniques and, crucially, domesticated crops like wheat and barley. The Egyptians adopted these crops, and they discovered something miraculous. If you store grain in a damp place and the Nile floods it, the grain sprouts. The starch turns to sugar. If you let it ferment, it becomes beer. The Egyptians became the greatest brewers of the ancient world. Everyone drank it, from the common laborers to the priests, who consumed it in massive quantities as part of their rituals. This culture was shaped by a profound fear of death. This fear is visible in every myth and every tomb. To deal with this fear, the elite eventually developed mummification. But for the common people, burial was simple. They were buried in the sand, facing west. Why west? Because that is where the sun sets. Already in the 4th millennium BC, the idea formed that life is the Nile, and the west, the desert, is the land of the dead. Did you know that many Egyptian gods started as animal totems? Take cats, for example. Early cities needed to protect their grain from mice, so they brought in steppe cats. These cats lived in temples and granaries, and over time, people began to see them as divine, leading to the worship of goddesses like Bastet and the fierce lioness Sekhmet. The Nile River also shaped their beliefs. Every year, it would turn red with clay, then green with vegetation, before leaving behind fertile black soil. This cycle of death and rebirth inspired one of Egypt's most important stories, the myth of Osiris. His jealous brother Seth murdered him and scattered his body parts. His wife Isis reassembled him into the first mummy and magically conceived their son Horus. Osiris then became the ruler of the underworld, which is why pharaohs were seen as the living Horus and became Osiris in death. Ever wondered how ancient Egypt came to be? It all started with climate change. Around 4000 BC, the lush Sahara dried up, forcing people to the Nile Valley. Suddenly, the population exploded, and farming became the only way to survive. But unlike Mesopotamia, the Nile was a gentle partner. Its predictable floods did most of the work, so you didn't need a huge government to manage it. At first, small cultures popped up like the Badarian people, famous for their beautiful black-topped pottery. Then came the Nekada culture, and things got really interesting. These weren't just farmers, they were traders. Imagine this, in an Egyptian tomb from 3500 BC, we find lapis lazuli all the way from Afghanistan. That's a supply chain stretching across Mesopotamia and the Levant. They also traded for cedar from Lebanon and gold from Nubia. The Nile became a superhighway, not just for goods but for power. War bands traveled on boats, and their leaders, the boat commanders, became the first chiefs. Soon, two major powers emerged in the south: Hierakonpolis, the city of the falcon god Horus, and Phoenix. These cities clashed, and we even see hints of a religious conflict between the followers of Horus and the god Seth. Around this time, writing appears, likely an idea borrowed from Mesopotamia but made uniquely Egyptian. Hieroglyphs aren't just pictures. They're a complex script. Fun fact, to know which way to read, just look at the animals. You always read into their faces. Society became deeply divided. You had the pack, the nobles, the Henmemet, the sun people or warriors, and the Rekhait, the commoners. The Rekhait were symbolized by a bird with broken wings, grounded and subject to the king's will. Finally, one figure steps out of the mists of history, King Narmer. His famous Narmer palette, from around 3100 BC, shows the unification of Egypt. On one side, he wears the white crown of the south. On the other, the red crown of the north. He's shown in the classic smiting pose, grabbing an enemy by the hair, an image of pharaonic power that would last for 3,000 years. Behind him stands his sandal bearer, proof that even at the dawn of history, bureaucracy was already a thing. With Narmer, the dynastic period began. The foundations were set, the writing, the religion, the social structure. The Egyptians built a civilization machine that would run for millennia, and they froze its story in stone for us to discover. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey back in time, don't forget to like and subscribe.